"Come on," I said, tapping the steering wheel nervously. I couldn't afford to miss anything. This business deal was too important to my boss. They had claimed that this was a make or break moment for my career, and arriving late for this meeting would jeopardize my employability. The thought made me feel doomed. I pulled out the pocket watch that had been given to me just that morning. It read 3:15 p.m., and the meeting was set to start in just 15 minutes. Unfortunately, I was a full 30 minutes away, and the traffic had come to a standstill, which felt like an eternity. The cars in front of me hadn't budged an inch. In those last 10 minutes, I held the pocket watch tightly, subconsciously praying that I would make it to the meeting on time. I placed the watch back into my pocket and took out my mobile to check the GPS for a detour. Just then, the screen flickered awkwardly before refreshing with a new route, a series of side streets that seemed to cut through the city. It looked tight, but it was my only chance. However, according to the city map, it seemed impossible to make it on time. As I gazed at the jam ahead of me, my stomach churned with frustration. I had to absorb the level of risk I was taking when I decided to exit the highway. The moment I did, the drivers behind me began honking their horns, which made me feel a bit foolish and, to be honest, quite angry. I had hoped to reach my destination in a timely manner, but now I was the only one taking this route. As I drove down the suggested exit, I found myself in a part of the city I had never visited before. The street was lined with old brick buildings that seemed much older than the newer infrastructure dominating the city. The road was strangely quiet. It was midday, and as far as I knew, this side of town wasn't known for being busy. I was driving fairly fast, but the absence of other vehicles nagged at me. Why was no one else using this route? The streets around me were entirely desolate, and ahead lay an endless, empty road littered with garbage and moss. It looked abandoned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was completely alone in this unfamiliar place. All alone, the 5 minutes that I drove felt excruciating. With every passing second, my nerves intensified. My phone buzzed incessantly, akin to losing the GPS signal. I glanced down, frowning as I noticed the blue dot stuck on the map. In a moment of frustration, I smacked my phone in a cartoonish attempt to make it work again. As I looked around, I realized that the buildings on either side of me were causing the road to narrow. These back streets resembled a maze, with one narrow alley stretching for miles and crossing paths that seemed almost too tight for even a man to squeeze through, let alone a car. I drove a few miles further until I confirmed my suspicion. The road was gradually becoming narrower. It was getting almost too tight for my vehicle. I cursed under my breath as the alley continued to stretch into the horizon, flanked by tall, grimy brown and gray buildings. I couldn't see where they ended, and the sheer vastness of this entire abandoned section of town left me wondering how I had never heard of it before. At this point, I had already given up on reaching the conference on time. The alley was becoming so constricted that I could hear a faint scratching noise as my wing mirror scraped against the rough surfaces of the buildings on either side. I maneuvered just enough to squeeze out of the car, intending to examine the road ahead. I switched off the engine, let out a deep breath, and stepped out. The minute my feet hit the ground, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension about what lay ahead. Under me, the ground felt strange as I walked through the alley. The air was thick with moisture and smelled of rust, mold, and something I couldn't quite recognize. Above me, the light seemed to dim slightly, despite the clear sky. The crushing weight of the buildings crowded in on me from either end. To my left, the road ahead appeared to brighten, so I pressed forward, realizing that my car could go no further. I planned to find the nearest business or any place that could offer help. I pulled out my phone to check for directions, but it was useless. The GPS app remained frozen at the last location where it had lost service. Frustrated, I shoved it back into my pocket and continued walking. As I moved, I began to notice the details of the surroundings. The walls of the buildings were stained and aged, while the streets were littered with debris and graffiti adorned every corner. Strangely, everything looked pale, as if it had been abandoned for quite some time. The windows were either boarded up or cracked, and I could see the filth accumulating in the air, accompanied by a dreadful stench of rot that intensified the further I walked. With each footstep, a sickening echo reverberated down the streets, amplifying the weight of my situation. I was beginning to realize that I was on the verge of losing my job, which made every step feel heavier than the last. I couldn't deny the worry creeping in. The frustration over the roadblock was fading, replaced by fears about my future. This was my best paying job ever, and I had no idea where to go from here. I took out the old pocket watch again, the one my wife, Alexis, had given me. She had smiled as she handed it to me, saying, "This is for good luck." It had been her grandfather's, a family heirloom that he claimed had the power to grant wishes. He had told her stories of its significance, attributing his victories to it, a tradition passed down through generations. Alexis had insisted I take it with me to this meeting, recalling how her father had given it to her after he injured his leg in an accident. The accident had left my father-in-law unable to run like he used to, which he always claimed was a strange reason for the watch's significance, perhaps an inside joke. I had laughed it off initially, pocketing the watch mostly out of respect. I didn't quite believe in things like wishes. After all, just a few moments ago, I had been eager to get to the meeting, and now here I was, feeling the weight of the watch a little heavier in my hand than I remembered. I turned the watch over, exposing its cracked face, with the hands frozen at 3:26 p.m. It had been working fine until I was sure of it. With a heavy sigh, I slipped the watch back into my pocket and continued walking. As I made my way back, I realized that my car had completely disappeared from view. The road straightened out ahead, but that felt impossible. I could only picture the way it curved slightly, so subtly that it was barely noticeable on foot. Turning around, I started walking back, determined to see if my suspicions were correct. What I didn't expect was to find myself walking for what felt like an eternity with no sign of my car. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road where the alley twisted into two paths, leaving me uncertain of which way to go. I was sure I hadn't seen a split in the paths before. Perhaps I had been too lost in my own thoughts, consumed by the realization of how screwed I was for missing the meeting. It felt as though I was moving blindfolded, not paying attention to my surroundings. I chose the left path, trusting my instincts and hoping I was making the right decision. As I continued walking, I noticed that my perception of time was distorting. I had no idea how long I had been walking. The alley wasn't as straight as I initially thought. Looking into the distance, I saw it wind and arch, shifting direction without warning. The buildings around me appeared decrepit, their filthy walls crumbling, and the pavements were in disrepair. They blended together so seamlessly that I began to feel as though I was walking in circles. I kept repeating to myself that the road would lead somewhere, that it had to. Finally, I glanced around at the countless buildings that surrounded me. Not a single sign or mark of a business was in sight. No restaurants, no shops, just a series of abandoned structures. If they did house someone, I didn't want to take my chances with whatever company they might keep. I pressed on, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The shadows grew darker, and the alley became ever narrower. After a while, I stopped to catch my breath, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle heavily on my shoulders. I was not an athlete, but I was sure I had covered quite a distance in that time. Yet nothing felt right, nothing at all. By now, I should have reached my car, or at least crossed to the other side of the city. The sun should have been high in the sky, but instead it was getting darker, as if twilight had come early. The buildings pressed overhead, their shadows creeping closer, and I felt as if I were slipping into a dream, a world that was shrinking and closing in on me. I glanced at my phone in despair. It was dead, and I couldn't even make a call. Taking a deep breath, I tried to keep calm. I had crossed so much distance, there had to be a way out. This couldn't just be an abandoned street or block. It felt like I was in a deserted city that shouldn't even exist. I had a vague idea of where I was supposed to be when I took that exit, yet this place shouldn't have been here. Determined to retrace my steps, I decided to go back to the first fork in the road and make a turn this time, hoping to find my way back to familiar ground. Reluctantly, I headed back the way I had come, but again, the path was different. I was sure there hadn't been any forks or turns on the main street I had been on. Instead of the winding alley I had walked for so long, 3 new paths awaited me, none of which looked even remotely familiar. My heart began to race as panic set in. I spun around in a circle, feeling disoriented. Choosing a direction at random, I started moving quickly, almost running. My shoes crashed onto the pavement, the sound reverberating around me, but the alley stretched on longer than before. Each step I took made my surroundings feel more claustrophobic, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I had no idea how long I had been moving like this. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. My legs ached and my throat was dry. I stopped looking at my watch on my phone. The time was perpetually frozen at 3:26. My head was pounding, and a sense of terror gnawed at me from the inside. The dark alleyways surrounding me felt alive. That's the only way I can describe it. The walls seemed to shift and change, and I couldn't even sense the turns. They multiplied and appeared out of nowhere, transforming the path into a maze. What lay before me was no longer a straight, stony road, but a convoluted path that crisscrossed and intersected within itself, leading me deeper into whatever this place was. I could feel a primal instinct in the air, a sense that this wasn't just some maze of backstreets. I began to jog, then run, realizing I couldn't keep this up forever. I wanted to escape as soon as possible, but the faster I moved, the more confused I became. The streets twisted in such strange ways that they sent me spinning in circles. I eventually fell to the ground, the silence around me deafening, with not even the echo of my footfalls breaking the stillness. I kept telling myself that I should have been out by now, but every turn led me to a dead end or to another unfamiliar stretch of streets. My breath grew ragged, fast gasps escaping my lips, and I had to pull over for a moment. As I stood up, hands on my knees in a last-ditch attempt to compose myself, that's when I heard it. Somewhere behind me, I heard the faintest sound, a soft shuffle amidst the silence. I stood upright, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back, but there was nothing but an empty path. My mind raced, and then the sound came again, closer this time. I realized it had to be coming from the turn deep ahead of me. I hoped that perhaps another person had gotten lost too, possibly led astray by their GPS. I knew it was evil to wish someone into my dire circumstance, but at least it would mean I wouldn't be alone in this. I slowly made my way forward, hoping to avoid scaring whoever was approaching. God knows how much I would detest encountering someone who was just as stressed as I was. The shuffling continued, uninterrupted by my advance, sounding as if whoever was around the corner was so exhausted that they were dragging their feet along the ground. I called out, letting them know I was friendly and asking if they were also lost, suggesting that we find an escape route together. But I received no response. In fact, as soon as I spoke, the sound of shuffling stopped completely. They must have been hesitant, which was understandable. I wished that my calm demeanor would settle them, so I gently approached the corner. Just as I reached out, I was caught off guard by what appeared before me. It spiked my adrenaline, and I spun around on the spot, taking off running so fast I felt like I could burn holes in the ground. All I saw was a hand, a gaunt, elongated semblance of a human hand, its proportions distorted in a way that warned me of the danger lurking just around the corner. A primal part of my brain screamed that I was about to become prey to whatever was coming. The echo of my footsteps was no longer the only sound in the air. It felt thick and heavy, as if I were running through water. I could hear the shuffling behind me, faster and more irrationally persistent. I didn't dare look back. I simply pushed on. My lungs were on fire, and my legs screamed in protest with every turn I made. The shuffling stayed ever close, echoing in a way that complicated my understanding of just how near it was. This only drove me to maintain a pace that felt too much for me. I knew I would taper off eventually, but I pushed myself, delaying the inevitable as much as my body would allow. I took turns randomly, having no time to second-guess my choices, fully aware that the design of the alley had no logic. Yet somehow, I still managed to make an incorrect choice. I turned blindly and ended up hitting a dead end. Light spilled through the cracks between the buildings, illuminating my doom. I could hear the shuffling behind me, dangerously close at the turn. It was too near. I couldn't backtrack. In a matter of seconds, it would be upon me. The thought of that was agonizing. I ran toward one of the openings between the buildings, clinging to the streets. God knows what squeezing between those structures would yield, but I had no choice. I pushed myself through, navigating the tight space as the shuffling continued to approach. Luckily, the gap was just wide enough for me, and I slid into it, pushing deeper into the shadows. The divide lessened the closer I got, and as I turned my head, I was suddenly overtaken by a wave of macabre curiosity. I caught a hasty glimpse of it, and that was enough for me to keep my head looking forward for the rest of the way. It had all the limbs of a human, but the proportions were all wrong. its arms stretched along the entire length of its towering frame, which must have been almost 7 feet tall. Despite being further back, its closest arm reached out toward me, hovering ominously in the air. Its fingers twitched as if ready to grab me the moment I was within range. The other hand dragged along the floor behind it, creating a familiar shuffling sound. Its skin had a rough texture and was pale in color, making a harsh sound against the walls as it pressed in on us, resisting the nodular defects of the poorly made bricks that composed these buildings, a luxury I did not have. The slightest dents in the walls cut into me, tearing at my suit and sometimes my skin. But I couldn't linger on those small pains when a major threat was slowly closing in on me. As I finally wriggled my way to the other side, I was eager to come back safe, absolutely and totally. With gaps in the buildings lost to my thoughts, I tried to keep up with that creative pattern and avoided entering any of the buildings just yet. I headed for the nearest building to my location and attempted to crack open the door. I could hear something behind me, a rabbit, perhaps, squeezing itself through the same path I had just followed, the sound echoing like a bastion of safety. But the door refused to budge. The human form finally emerged from the cramped space with a disgusting pop, and adrenaline kicked back in as I was already in a full sprint, my pounding feet echoing against the ground. Then I realized there was another sound, a faint ticking. It was not easy to hear, but there was a soft, rhythmic circling. I pulled out my watch and stared at its cracked face. The clock hands were moving in a sort of chaotic dance. It read 2:11, with all hands pointing in the same direction. Perhaps it had been damaged in the tight squeeze, and all those hands turned in procession, not indicating the time, but something far more unsettling. It was as if the watch was representing a road, much like a compass, guiding me as I ran in one direction. The tick-tock of the watch began to grow more frantic, matching the increasing cacophony of the shuffling behind me. I quickened my step, pushing myself to the limit, but I wasn't running blindly. I let the soft, steady rhythm guide me through the maze of alleyways, a sick game of hot and cold. The creature was still behind me, and at first, nothing happened. The shuffling didn't stop. Eventually, I spotted a faint red car in the distance. It was parked in the same spot where I had left it, as if nothing had happened. The moment I saw the car, the watch's rhythmic ticks became wild, mirroring the creature's quickening pace. All my senses seemed to narrow down to a singular focus, running as fast as I could to reach the car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, and the thing was so close now that I could almost feel the wetness of its breath on the back of my neck. I jammed the key into the lock, flung open the door, and leaped inside, slamming it shut just as the creature reached me. The car vibrated as the beast crashed into it, and I clamped my eyes shut, desperate to avoid seeing that thing again. For a moment, everything went perfectly silent. I sat there in disbelief, my breath fast from the long sprint. The heavy breathing must have been too much for me, or perhaps the panic finally set in because I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself parked in my designated spot at an office building. I checked my phone out of habit and saw the time, 3:28 p.m., 2 minutes before my meeting. I was punctual, despite the shock of remembering what had happened. I straightened myself as I got out of the car, not wasting any time. I pushed open the door and walked toward the meeting room. I replied vaguely when asked about my whereabouts, unsure of how I had escaped, but I knew the watch was attached to it. I distinctly remembered holding it while stuck in traffic, wishing I could make it to my meeting on time. And there I was, having made it, yet the memory lingered, haunting me. I recalled the discussion about how there was no exit. I remembered turning off the road and stopping in a lay-by, realizing that no matter how many times I tried, none of the alternative routes existed from that spot. It seemed my wish had come true, just as my grandfather-in-law had told my wife, but at a cost. Now it finally made sense why it had been passed down to her when her father had hurt his leg.